Some minds don't sleep, they remember.
On August 15th, 2025, in the crisp, biting chill of Anchorage, Alaska, the global spotlight converged on a frozen runway at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. The world held its collective breath, captivated by the sight of two of the planet's most influential and polarizing figures, U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, engaging in a high-stakes dialogue amid swirling snow flurries and the distant hum of military aircraft. They stood there, on this remote edge of the continent, hashing out the precarious themes of war, peace, and the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict. With no immediate breakthroughs but hints of tentative progress that left analysts speculating for days, long before these modern summits, economic sanctions, and leaked documents from nearby hotels stirred international intrigue, Alaska told a far more layered tale. This vast, untamed wilderness was once a shared domain, a territory both nations proudly claimed as their own at different points in history. It was a land bartered in secretive deals, cast aside in moments of imperial fatigue, and yet, it has never truly known lasting tranquility. Its icy expanses hiding echoes of conquests, forgotten battles, and enduring rivalries. So, what enigmatic secrets slumber beneath Alaska's ancient permafrost, right under the boots of these two leaders, as they navigated discussions on Ukraine's fate and potential future trilateral talks? Is it merely layers of history and indigenous myths, or something more shadowy and profound, perhaps unresolved geopolitical tensions, or untapped resources fueling new rivalries in a thawing Arctic? This narrative transcends a mere diplomatic encounter. It's an exploration of a resilient land that has silently observed centuries of power plays, from colonial exploits to Cold War standoffs, and now a renewed chapter in global chess where old adversaries meet anew. If you unafraid to delve deeper and unearth the truths concealed under that unyielding ice truths that might challenge perceptions of empire, exploration, and endurance, then hit subscribe to the channel right now. Our immersive journey into the heart of the last frontier, with its tales of triumph, tragedy, and timeless mystery, kicks off immediately. The Russian Alaska. In the introduction, we stood on a frigid runway in Anchorage, witnessing the two most powerful men on Earth face each other on a piece of land called Alaska land that is not just a stage, but a silent witness to games of power. But before the summits, before the camera flashes and the grand speeches about peace or war, there were other people, other stories. They didn't come here to negotiate or shape the world. They came to hunt for a treasure, something sparkling and warm in the midst of this harsh, frozen land. They called it soft gold. Tonight, we will not speak of modern America or its skyscrapers. We will turn back time, returning to the first chapter of modern Alaska chapter written in the blood, sweat, and ambition of the Russian Empire. This is the story of a time when Alaska was not an American state, but a distant colony of the Tsar, a land where the dream of wealth collided with the brutal reality of life and death. Join me as we travel back through the centuries, back to the 1700s, when the Russian Empire, under the iron hand of Tsar Peter the Great, burned with an unprecedented thirst for expansion. They had conquered the endless forests of Siberia, crossed the frozen mountain ranges, and now they stood before a new, vast, and mysterious horizon, the Pacific Ocean. An ocean that promised nothing but ferocious storms and undiscovered lands. But in the shadow of that uncertainty, they saw opportunity, an opportunity to expand their empire, to touch treasures no European kingdom had ever dreamed of. And to realize that dream, the Tsar placed his faith in one man, Vitus Bering, a Danish explorer with a brave heart and a fearless spirit. Imagine his voyages in 1741. No GPS, no radar, no modern equipment for navigation. It's only fragile wooden ships, flawed hand-drawn maps, and a courage that bordered on madness. Facing waves as high as mountains and storms that could swallow an entire fleet, Bering and his crew crossed the deadly waters of the Arctic Ocean to become the first Europeans to lay eyes on a majestic wild land that we now call Alaska. But they didn't find cities of gold, no splendid palaces like in the legends. Instead, they discovered another treasure, one more precious than silver or gold, hidden in the cold waters of the Pacific, the sea otter. Their fur, incredibly dense, silky, and warm, was a luxury that merchants in China and Europe were willing to pay a fortune for. It was called soft gold, a natural treasure that could turn hunters into kings. Now news of the sea otters spread like wildfire, and a fever erupted, drawing ships from distant Russia across the ocean to this new land. The men who flocked to Alaska were not noble explorers sponsored by the court. They were the pro-Michelin Icarushan fur hunters, men who carried the grit of Siberian cowboys. Picture them, hardened men, their skin weathered by the elements, their cold eyes unafraid of any danger from violent sea storms to bloody clashes on land. They came to Alaska with knives, guns, and a burning ambition, to seize the treasure of this land no matter the cost. To organize this large-scale hunt, the Russian-American company was born a semi-state, semi-private entity, granted the right by the Tsar to govern and exploit the new colony. They built crude wooden outposts, small Orthodox churches with domes glistening under the faint sun, and began their conquest. But Alaska was not an empty land waiting to be claimed. It was home to dozens of indigenous tribes, people who had lived here for thousands of years, in harmony with the harsh yet magical rhythm of nature. They were hunters, storytellers, keepers of the flame, living in a delicate balance with the mountains, rivers, and seas. The meeting between these two worlds, the Russians and the indigenous people, was not a story of peaceful trade or friendly discovery. It was an invasion, a chapter of history written in blood and tears. The first victims of Russian ambition were the Inuit people, a tribe living on the Aleutian island chain. Master sea hunters with fragile kayaks that glided over the waves like birds, but the Russians did not come to learn or respect. They came to plunder. The Inuit people were not only stripped of the precious otter pelts, they were stripped of their very freedom. Inuit men were captured, forced to paddle into treacherous seas, facing killer whales, towering waves, and sudden storms that could swallow them in an instant. If they failed to deliver the quota of furs demanded by the Russian-American company, their families, their wives, their children would be tortured or killed as a warning. This was not just exploitation, it was a brutal form of slavery, a systematic oppression designed to drain the life out of an entire people. The result was a silent tragedy. The Inuit population plummeted by as much as 80% in just a few decades, due to violence, diseases brought from Europe by the Russians, and the devastation of a system that saw them not as human beings, but as tools for profit. But not all indigenous tribes submitted easily to the Russian blade and gun. As the Russians pushed further inland, they encountered a much more formidable opponent, the Tlingit people. This was a proud nation of warriors living in well-organized villages. With intricately carved longhouses and totem poles that told their history, the Tlingit did not bow to outsiders. They fought with courage and a determination to protect their ancestral lands. The confrontation between them and the Russians erupted in 1802 and 1804, in the Battle of Sitka, a bloody battle, where Chief Catlian led the Tlingit against the guns and cannons of the Russian-American company. They fought with all their pride, but ultimately, the technological might of the Russians prevailed. Sitka fell into Russian hands, and the Tlingit were pushed to the brink of survival. Russian Alaska was an empire built on violence, exploitation, and dreams of wealth. Their outposts rose like scars on the land. Their Orthodox churches stood silently in the deep forests as reminders of an ambition that was never satisfied. But that empire, however cruel, could not last. Alaska was too distant, too harsh, too expensive to maintain, and more importantly, the treasure of soft gold was depleted. The sea otters, once frolicking in the bays, were hunted to the verge of extinction. By the mid-19th century, the Alaskan colony was no longer a glittering gold mine. It became a burden, a fated dream in the freezing cold. The Russian Empire, after draining the life from this land, began looking for a way out. They no longer saw value in the snow-covered forests, the icy rivers, or the wild coastlines. And so, they made a decision that would change history. to sell Alaska land that was once the pride of the Xertu, a new, rising empire in the West? Let's pause and reflect. Is every discovery in history perhaps a form of conquest? Behind the heroic tales of explorers crossing oceans, is there always another story of people dispossessed of lands whose voices were stolen? When we recount history, whose voice do we choose to hear, the victors or the forgottens? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Like and a subscribe are a promise that you are ready to dig into the dark corners of history, ready to listen to the stories buried beneath the ice of Alaska. The Russian Empire came and went, leaving behind Orthodox churches standing silently in the deep forests. Scars that would never heal on the memory of the indigenous people in a land that had still not found peace. But a new empire was coming, not with swords and muskets, but with a piece of paper and a signature. In the next part, we will talk about the bargain of the century, a transaction that changed the fate of Alaska and laid the foundation for the tensions we still witness on that Anchorage runway today. The bargain of the century. In the previous part, we left behind an Alaska dying under Russian hands. A colony, once brilliant with the soft gold of sea otter fur, was now just a depleted land. The otters were hunted to the brink of extinction. The Russian-American company was drowning in debt. And the Russian Empire, after a bitter defeat in the Crimean War of 1853, faced a harsh reality. They no longer had the strength to hold Alaska, remote, harsh territory, right next door to their greatest rival, the British Empire, which ruled neighboring Canada. Alaska, at that time, was like a ship adrift in a frozen ocean, abandoned in a storm of neglect. The Russian Empire no longer wanted this burden. They needed to cut their losses to escape the land they once saw as a treasure, but now considered a curse. And in that moment of desperation, they turned to a young rising power, an unlikely partner. The United States, a nation still struggling to find its place on the world stage. Tonight, we don't speak of conquests with swords or muskets. We speak of a silent conquest, carried out with ink and paper, with a check that changed history. This is the story of the bargain of the century, a deal mocked by an entire nation, but which ultimately became one of the greatest decisions in human history. Join me as we return to a night in March 1867. In Washington, D.C., imagine a small office, the dim light of oil lamps casting shadows on dark wood-paneled walls. Cigar smoke hung in the air, carrying the scent of ambition and tension. In one corner, U.S. Secretary of State William Seward, man with a sharp gaze and a dream of expansion for the young American nation, sat across from Baron Edouard de Stokel, the Russian ambassador, a seasoned diplomat whose polite smile concealed deep calculations. The negotiations lasted all night, from the early evening hours until the pale dawn peeked through the window. Every word, every number proposed, was like a move in a fateful game of chess. And then, at 4 o'clock in the morning, while the city was still asleep, they reached an agreement. The United States would purchase the entire territory of Alaska from Russia. The price? $7.2 million? Let that number sink in. $7.2 million for a landmass of over 1.7 million square kilometers, more than twice the size of Texas, larger than many European nations combined. It worked out to less than 2 cents per acre of Alaskan land. Today, that amount of money wouldn't even be enough to buy a penthouse in Manhattan or a supercar. But in 1867, it bought a vast, wild land of snow-capped mountains, endless forests, and infinite coastlines. This was one of the greatest real estate deals in history. A deal that, on paper, seemed like an incredible victory for the United States. But when the news broke, there were no cheers, no glasses of wine raised in celebration. Instead, there was a storm of criticism, a wave of fierce ridicule from the public, the press, and even the U.S. Congress. They called it Seward's folly. They called Alaska Seward's icebox, or Walrussia barren wasteland of nothing but ice, polar bears, and a few Eskimo tribes they considered worthless. A New York newspaper sarcastically wrote, "We have just spent $7 million to buy the Tsars' private polar bear garden." A senator declared that Seward had thrown taxpayers' money at a giant ice cube that nobody needed. The American public, having just endured a civil war and struggling with Reconstruction, couldn't understand why the government would spend such a huge sum on a remote land they had never seen. Seward became the target of ridicule. He was called a dreamer, an impractical politician, a man who had gambled the country's future on a fanciful dream. But Seward did not waver. In his heart, he held a vision that few of his contemporaries could grasp. He didn't just see Alaska as a frozen land, he saw it as a strategic gateway to Asia, an Arctic outpost, a land rich with undiscovered resources. He believed that Alaska's value lay not in the present, but in the future, where America would need its vastness and unique position to assert itself on the world stage. Seward's fight to get the treaty ratified by Congress was an uphill battle. In the Senate, senators argued fiercely, calling it a foolish waste. But Seward, with his persistence and eloquence, won by just a single vote. On October 18, 1867, in Sitka, the former capital of Russian Alaska, the Russian flag was lowered in a quiet ceremony. The stars and stripes of the United States were raised, marking the beginning of a new empire on this land. For many years after, it seems Seward's critics were right. Alaska remained a remote, desolate, and difficult-to-govern territory. The U.S. government all but forgot about it, leaving the forests and glaciers to sink back into silence. But then everything changed. The Klondike Gold Rush in the late 1890s exploded like a wildfire. Tens of thousands of people from across America and the world flocked to Alaska, carrying dreams of striking it rich. The rivers of the Yukon became rivers of gold, and Seward's icebox suddenly became hotter than ever. But gold was just the beginning. By the mid-20th century, another treasure was discovered, a treasure that was pitch black, flowing from the earth: oil. The massive oil fields at Prudhoe Bay turned Alaska into one of the wealthiest states in America, contributing billions of dollars to the economy. Seward's folly turned out not to be folly at all. It was the bargain of the century, a decision that changed the destiny of the United States and established Alaska as a strategic pillar of the nation. But Alaska's true value, as Seward had predicted, was not just in its gold or oil. It was in its location and position that made Alaska a vital outpost, a gateway to the Arctic and Asia, a launching pad for America's global ambitions. Let's pause and reflect. In history, how many great decisions were once mocked, considered crazy at the time they were made? What separates a dreamer from a visionary? Is it luck, or the ability to see what others cannot? And as we look back on this bargain, do we truly understand the price that Alaska and the people who lived on this land had to pay to become part of the American dream? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A like and a subscribe are a promise that you are willing to look beyond the headlines, ready to explore the hidden stories of history. Alaska, from a ridiculed land, became a crown jewel of the United States. But that jewel did not lie dormant. The old neighbor of the Russian Empire, now the Soviet Union, would soon become the new owner's greatest enemy. And Alaska, with its strategic position, would become the hottest front line in a war with no gunshots: the Cold War. In the next part, we will step into an era when Alaska was no longer a giant ice cube, but a strategic fortress where two superpowers faced off in silence. And the secrets under the ice began to stir. The Cold War frontier. In the previous part, we saw America smiling victoriously. Seward's folly turned out not to be folly, but a stroke of genius. Alaska, once mocked as an icebox or a polar bear garden, had revealed its glittering treasures: gold from the Klondike Rush, oil from Prudhoe Bay. But Alaska's true value, the one William Seward had foreseen over a century earlier, wasn't gold or oil. It was its locational strategic position that made this land an irreplaceable piece on the global chessboard of power. And by the mid-20th century, that location suddenly became priceless in a terrifying way. Tonight, we leave behind the gold rushes and the dreams of wealth to enter a darker chapter in Alaska's history. This is not a story of prospectors or indigenous tribes, This is the story of a war without gunfire, without smoke, but only a button press away from Armageddon. This is the story of Alaska transformed from a forgotten wilderness into the hottest front line of the Cold War, where two superpowers faced off in a deadly dance of deterrence and fear. Look at a world map, but this time, look at it through the eyes of a military strategist in the 1950s. What do you see? You'll see that America's greatest enemy, the Soviet Union, wasn't just across the Atlantic, thousands of miles away. They were a neighbor, just a few miles from Alaska across a frozen strait called Bering. This strait, less than 100 kilometers wide, was a thin line between two worlds. Between freedom and communism, between the USA and the USSR. And if you cast your eyes northward, over the snow-capped mountains and fields of permafrost, you'll realize a terrifying truth. The shortest route for a Soviet nuclear bomber to attack major American cities like New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles was not across Europe. It was over the North Pole, directly through the skies of Alaska. Suddenly, the land once called a giant ice cube became the most critical front line of the free world. Alaska was no longer a remote land of fur trappers and gold miners. It became a frozen fortress, an invisible battlefield, where the fate of humanity was wagered every second, every minute. The transformation began, quietly but fiercely. An unprecedented military buildup was deployed across the land. Air Force bases sprouted like mushrooms on the frozen plains. Runways miles long were carved into the permafrost, where fighter jets and bombers stood ready to take off at a moment's notice. Secret military bases were built inside mountains, hidden beneath the white snow, like ever-watchful eyes scanning the sky. And then, one of the most magnificent and paranoid defense projects in history was born. The Dew Line, the distant early warning line. Imagine a chain of over 60 massive radar stations, stretching nearly 5,000 kilometers from the coast of Alaska across Canada to Greenland. It was like an invisible electronic fence, designed to detect any sign of a Soviet bomber attempting to cross the Arctic. Each radar station was a small fortress, standing defiantly amidst a sea of white ice, with giant antennas turning slowly in the wind, like eternal sentinels. The Dew Line was not just a technological marvel. It was a symbol of the era's fear, the fear of a nuclear war that could wipe out humanity. The system was built to give the US a few precious hours, a few precious minutes, to react to an attack. It was a reminder that during the Cold War, the world lived in a delicate balance, where the smallest mistake could lead to doomsday. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the young soldiers sent to those radar stations. They were boys fresh out of school, sent to isolated bases in the middle of the frigid tundra, where there was nothing but snow, wind, and darkness. The 6-month winter meant 6 months of perpetual night, when the sun never rose, when temperatures could drop to -50, 60 degrees Celsius, so cold that your breath froze the moment it left your mouth. What was their job? To sit in small rooms, heated by oil furnaces, staring at radar screens with their flickering green blips? 12 hours a day, they stood guard, waiting for a small, unusual dot of light that could be a Soviet bomber. They weren't just working. They were guarding the survival of the world, carrying the unimaginable weight of that responsibility on their shoulders. A moment of distraction, a missed signal, could be the difference between peace and annihilation. But in the skies above Alaska, a deadly game was constantly played. Soviet bombers, the Tu-95 Bears with their enormous wings, frequently flew close to Alaskan airspace, hovering just on the invisible line of US territory. This was no random act. It was a provocation, a way to test the response of the American air defense system, to probe the patience and speed of their adversary. Immediately, from bases in Anchorage or Fairbanks, American F-15 fighter jets would scramble, soaring into the frozen sky to welcome the uninvited guests. The two sides would fly in parallel, sometimes only meters apart, their wings almost touching, the pilots hidden behind their cockpit glass could see each other's faces, cold, wordless gazes that held a world of tension. They didn't speak, they didn't fire. They simply sent a silent message. We are here, we are watching, we are ready. This was a war of nerves, a a dance of deterrence. Every move was carefully calculated, but a single misstep could ignite a catastrophe. Alaska, a land of silence and solitude, had become the stage for the quietest but most intense confrontations between the two superpowers. Imagine this. What would it be like to live right next to the enemy, with tension hanging over you like a ghost?
Yeah.
Does living on an invisible front line, where any day could be the last, shape the character of a land of the people born and raised there? Does it make them more resilient, more independent, but also more skeptical of the world around them? And does Alaska, in its role as a frozen fortress, carry scars from those years of tension? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Like and a subscribe are a promise that you are willing to delve into the silent stories of history, ready to listen to the voice of a land that has seen too much. The war of radar machines, aircraft, and geopolitical calculations turned Alaska into a front line of the modern age. But this land holds other wars more ancient, more primal, and perhaps far more terrifying. In the next part, we will leave behind the superpowers and their games of power. We will step into the world of the spirits of the North, stories, legends, and mysteries that have existed on this land for thousands of years, waiting to be awakened from beneath the permafrost. Myths and spirits of the North. In the previous part, we stood on the front line of the Cold War, where Alaska was transformed into a frozen fortress, a geopolitical chessboard where two superpowers faced off in a deadly silence. That was a war of men, of radar machines, of cold calculations drawn in green light on a screen. But Alaska is not just a stage for the schemes of empires. It is a living land, a place that carries stories far more ancient, more primal, and perhaps far more terrifying. Tonight, we put aside the military maps, the aerial encounters, and the sounds of machinery. We will listen to the whispers of Alaska itself, stories not written in history books, but carved into the memory of the mountains, passed down for thousands of years around campfires. This is the story of the spirits of the North, of the myths of the indigenous peoples, the Tlingit, Aleut, Yupik, Inuit, who have lived on this land since before time was recorded. For them, Alaska was not a piece of land to be exploited, not a resource to be seized. It was a living entity, where every mountain has a story, every river carries a spirit, and every animal possesses its own will. In their world, the boundary between humans and nature does not exist. Everything is connected, everything is sacred. But within that connection also lie mystery and fear, because not all spirits of the North are friendly. Join me as we step into the gloomy coastal forests of southeastern Alaska, where fog clings to the ancient trees, where sunlight filters through the leaves like faint rays of light. Listen. Do you hear it? That cry, faint but sharp, as if calling you from deep within the forest? If you were a Tlingit hunter, lost among the cold trees, you would know that is not the sound of a child. It is a trap. And the one setting the trap is one of the most terrifying creatures in North American mythology, the Kushtaka. The Tlingit say the Kushtaka is a shapeshifter, half man, half otter, with fur that shimmers like water and eyes as cold as ice. Can mimic the cry of a child, the call for help of a woman, or even the voice of your loved ones, to lure you deeper into the forest, closer to the frigid rivers. And when you get too close, the Kushtaka reveals its true form. It might tear you apart with its sharp claws, or more terrifyingly, steal your soul, turning you into another Kushtaka forever trapped between two worlds, yearning for human warmth, but never able to touch it. Is this just a ghost story to scare children, to keep them close to the campfire? Or is it a deeper warning encoded over centuries? A way for the ancestors to teach their descendants about the dangers of the coastal forests, where fog can disorient you, where the cold can make your body tremble and your mind hallucinate just before you die of hypothermia. Story to remind them. Do not go alone. Do not trust what you hear in the darkness. Stay near the tribe's fire, where life is protected. But the Kushtaka is just one of the spirits of the North. Look up at the sky on a frigid winter night in Alaska, when darkness envelops everything. You will see one of nature's most magnificent sights, the aurora borealis, the northern lights. Ribbons of green, purple, and red light dance across the sky like living silk, swirling as if guided by an invisible hand. To us, it is a scientific phenomenon, charged particles from the sun colliding with the atmosphere, creating spectacular light shows. But to the Inuit, the Yupik, and many other tribes, the northern lights are not science. They are spiritual. They believe those bands of light are the spirits of the departed, playing a game of ball in the sky with the skull of a walrus. Or for some tribes, it is the gateway to the other world, a bridge that shamans, chosen ones, can cross to communicate with the gods, with ancestors, or with wandering spirits in the universe. Those lights are not just a phenomenon. They are a reminder that the worlds of the living and the dead are never separate. Their ancestors are still there, dancing in the sky, watching over their descendants, carrying memory and protection. These myths were not told to explain a natural phenomenon. We're told to connect, to turn a cold night sky into a sacred space, where the stories of the ancestors are still alive, where every ribbon of light is a whisper from the past. The northern lights, in the eyes of the indigenous people, are not just light. They are a song of life, of memory, and of immortality. Two ways of seeing the world. One sees the Kushtaka and finds a monster, a threat hidden in the darkness. One looks at the northern lights and sees ancestors, an eternal connection between humanity and the cosmos. One worldview built on fear and vigilance, another built on faith and sacredness. Why do wild, harsh lands like Alaska give birth to such rich mythology? Is it that when humans become small before nature, when our voices are swallowed by the wind and ice, we can finally hear the whispers of the land? Are the stories of the Kushtaka, of the northern lights, the way indigenous people found meaning in a world that is both beautiful and brutal? What of we modern people, living among machines and cities, lost by no longer telling stories like these? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A like and a subscribe are a promise that you are willing to listen to the whispers of the land, willing to believe that there are stories that cannot be explained by science, but can only be felt with the heart. These myths, whether terrifying or sacred, all stem from a deep connection with nature, with the land of Alaska. But Alaska has other stories, more worldly, but no less legendary. Stories of fevers, gold fever, oil fevers that drew people from all over the world, bringing with them dreams of wealth and leaving new scars on this land. In the next part, we will leave the spirits of the North to enter a world of human ambition where gold and oil are not just resources, but new myths, shaping the destiny of Alaska and the people who live on this land. The gold fever, the oil fever. In the previous part, we listened to the whispers of Alaska stories of the Kushtaka, of spirits dancing in the northern lights. Those were the myths of the indigenous people, born from a deep connection with nature, from a reverence for a land both beautiful and harsh. But those who came later, the Russians, the Americans, did not come to listen to the voices of the mountains or the rivers. They came to dig, to tear up the earth, to search for glittering things that could turn dreams into reality. Tonight, we set aside the spiritual tales to enter another chapter of Alaska's history, a chapter written in greed, recklessness, and human ingenuity. This is the story of two fevers that shaped modern Alaska, the Klondike Gold Rush and the Prudhoe Bay Oil. Boom. Two fevers that not only changed this land, but also left deep scars on the environment, the culture, and the very souls of the people who set foot here. Let's start with the Klondike Gold Rush at the end of the 19th century. Imagine a world mired in economic depression, where families struggled to make a living, where the dream of a better life seemed like a mirage. And then, in 1896, news spread like a wildfire. Gold. Gold had been found in the rivers of the Yukon region, right near the Alaskan border. Those two words, real gold, were like magic, a promise of a new life, a chance to escape poverty and become a millionaire. The news spread from Seattle to New York, from London to remote villages in Europe. Over 100,000 people, farmers, craftsmen, office clerks, even ladies and gentlemen, left everything behind. They sold their homes, their farms, and pooled all their savings to buy tickets for trains and ships, heading north to a land they knew only through rumors. They were called the Stampeders, the adventurers, the people swept up in the fever of the Golden Dream. But the path to the Klondike was not an easy journey. It was paved not with gold, but with ice, starvation, and death. Imagine an endless line of people like a column of ants, crawling over treacherous mountain passes like the Chilkoot Pass near vertical slope covered in snow and ice, where every step was a battle against nature. They carried hundreds of pounds of supplies on their backs, food, tools, and hope, having to trek back and forth dozens of times to bring the required year's worth of goods into the wilderness. Many collapsed not from deadly avalanches, but from exhaustion, from the biting cold, from a hunger that made their bodies tremble like dry leaves. Horses and mules were worked to death, falling on the trail, leaving paths littered with animal carcasses. Known as the Dead Horse Trail, the survivors had to fight not only the harsh winter, but also the greed and desperation in their own souls. And when they finally reached the Klondike, what awaited them? Not rivers glittering with gold as in their dreams. Most of the best claims had already been taken by those who arrived first. Only a handful of stampeders actually found gold and became rich. The people who made the most money, it turned out, were not the miners, but those who sold shovels, tents, or opened saloons and stores in the boom towns that sprang up around the gold fields. The Klondike Gold Rush, in the end, was not a story of wealth. It was a tragedy of human nature, of how a promise could turn ordinary people into risk-takers, willing to gamble their lives chasing a phantom. The gold rush came and went, like a fever, leaving behind ghost towns, broken dreams, and an Alaska that sank back into silence. The land once called an icebox seemed to have returned to its forgotten fate, but Alaska did not sleep for long. Nearly 70 years later, a new treasure was discovered, a treasure not sparkling like gold, but pitch black, powerful, and carrying the energy of an entire civilization. In 1968, at Prudhoe Bay, a remote spot on the coast of the Arctic Ocean, where there was nothing but snow and wind, they found oil. Not just any oil field. This was the largest oil discovery ever made in North America, a black ocean hidden deep beneath the permafrost. News of Prudhoe Bay spread, and a new fever erupted, the oil fever. This time, the newcomers were not lone adventurers with pickaxes and dreams. They were giant corporations with multi-million-dollar machinery, engineers, and ambitious plans. But the challenge they faced was no less severe. How do you extract and transport billions of barrels of oil from one of the coldest and wildest places on the planet? How do you move black gold across mountain ranges, rivers, and unstable frozen ground? The answer was one of the greatest and most controversial engineering feats of the 20th century, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Imagine a giant steel serpent, nearly 800 miles long, winding through 3 majestic mountain ranges, crossing hundreds of rivers, and traversing the wildest parts of Alaska. This pipeline was not just a structure, it was a challenge to nature itself. To build it, over 70,000 workers were mobilized, working in unimaginable conditions. Temperatures dropped to minus 60 degrees Celsius, where breath froze the moment it left the mouth. The permafrost an unstable foundation that could melt or shift required unprecedented engineering designs. The pipeline was elevated on special supports to avoid melting the ice, designed to withstand the strongest earthquakes and insulated against the biting cold. The workers labored day and night, facing blizzards, wildlife, and the absolute isolation of the wilderness. In 1977, that steel serpent began to carry its first flows of oil, and Alaska was changed forever. Wealth poured in like a flood. From a ridiculed territory, Alaska became one of the states with the highest per capita income in America. A special fund, the Alaska Permanent Fund, was established. It's taken a portion of the oil profits to pay an annual dividend to every resident, a model that was almost utopian, where every citizen shared in the wealth from the earth. But that wealth did not come without a price. Oil spills, like the 1989 Exxon Valdez disaster, devastated Alaska's fragile ecosystems, leaving indelible scars on the sea and land. Indigenous communities, already wounded by centuries of history, now faced a new industrial invasion. And a never-ending conflict erupted between the need to extract resources to sustain a modern economy and the effort to preserve one of the last great wildernesses on the planet. Two fevers, one driven by the individual dream of wealth, the other driven by the needs of an entire industrial civilization. Both turned Alaska into a land of paradoxes, both a symbol of opportunity and a testament to the price of greed. Let's be honest with ourselves. If you were faced with a choice between a life of poverty in harmony with nature, and a chance for quick wealth at the cost of the environment and culture, what would you choose? Can a society be sustainable when it is built on fevers of non-renewable resource extraction? And will Alaska, the land of gold and oil, ever find a balance between man and nature, or will it forever be a battlefield of ambitions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A like and a subscribe are a promise that you are ready to delve into the stories of Alaska stories, not just of wealth, but of the prices paid. The gold and oil fevers have shaped the Alaska of today. The original story of the clash of empires that brought men here is not yet over. In the final part, we will return to Anchorage, where the two most powerful leaders in the world stand face to face on a cold runway, and where Alaska once again becomes the center of a global game of power. The present tension, the previous part, we were swept up in the fevers, the Klondike gold rush, and the Prudhoe Bay oil boom dreams of wealth that changed Alaska forever, transforming it from a ridiculed territory into a crown jewel of the United States. But those fevers, however intense, were just the story of man, of greed, and the ambition to conquer nature. But the original conflict, the clash of empires that first brought men to Alaska, has it truly ended? Or is it merely dormant, waiting for a moment to reawaken? Tonight, in the final chapter of our journey, we return to Anchorage, where the two most powerful leaders in the world stand face to face on a cold runway on August 15th, 2025, and we will see that Alaska, once again, is not just a piece of land. It is a silent witness, a front line in a global game of power that never closed. Look at our world today, in 2025. The Arctic is changing at a dizzying pace. The permanent ice caps, once an immutable symbol of Alaska, are now melting faster than ever. This melting is not just an environmental catastrophe, threatening fragile species and ecosystems. It is also opening new route shipping lanes through the Arctic Ocean, shortcuts connecting Asia, Europe, and North America. These routes carry not only cargo ships, but also ambition, conflict, and a new race to control the untapped resources beneath the icy seafloor. And who are the main players in this race for control of the Arctic? None other than the two giants who have faced off on this very land before: the United States and an increasingly assertive Russia. The Bering Strait, less than 100 kilometers wide, has once again become the dividing line between two powers, with its strategic location no longer just a remote U.S. state. It is America's balcony, looking directly into Russia's backyard. The military bases built during the Cold War are now being upgraded with urgent speed. It's the most advanced stealth fighters, the F-22s and F-35s, patrol the Alaskan skies, not to counter the old bombers of the Soviet Union, but to monitor Russia's nuclear submarines and hypersonic missiles weapons that can change the game in minutes. The cat-and-mouse game of 50 years ago seems to be replaying, but this time with far more dangerous toys. Imagine submarines gliding silently beneath the Arctic ice, carrying missiles that can wipe out an entire city. Imagine military satellites sweeping across the sky, recording every movement in the Bering Strait. And imagine young soldiers, once again, sitting in isolated bases in Alaska, staring at radar screens, carrying the weight of a world on the brink. And that is why, when U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin stand facing each other on the Anchorage runway, The shadow of Alaska is not just a backdrop, it is a reminder of a shared past, of the 1867 purchase that transferred Alaska from Russian to American hands. A reminder of a Cold War that never truly ended but was only frozen for a few decades and is now thawing again, just like the Arctic ice caps. Alaska is not just a land of ice and myth. It is a silent witness, having seen the rise and fall of the Russian colony, the expansion of the American empire, the tense standoffs of the Cold War, and now, a new race to control the Arctic. It seems Alaska's fate is to be forever caught between giants, between empires in a ceaseless struggle for power. But Alaska is not just a chessboard. It is also the home of indigenous peoples, of the spirits of the North, of people who lived in harmony with this land for thousands of years before any empires arrived. And even today, amidst the geopolitical tensions, these communities continue to fight to protect their culture, their land, and their way of life against the encroachment of modern forces. Our journey, which began at a summit on an Anchorage runway, now comes to a close. We have traveled through the Russian conquest, witnessed the bargain of the century when America bought Alaska, shivered on the front lines of the Cold War, listened to the whispers of the northern spirits, and been swept up in the fevers of gold and oil. Each chapter is a piece of the puzzle of Alaska land that is not just ice and snow, but a living testament to human ambition, conflict, and resilience. So what legacy do you think has shaped Alaska the most? Is it the legacy of the Russian Empire, with its scars of violence and exploitation? Is it the legacy of American expansion, with Seward's vision and the resource rushes? Or is it the legacy of the spirits of the North, the stories of the indigenous people, the myths of the Kushtaka and the Northern Lights, which still echo in the wind, long after the empires of men have turned to dust? And the final question, will Alaska, with all its beauty and tragedy, ever escape its fate as a front line, a chessboard for empires? Or will it forever be a land caught between giants, carrying both the dreams and the nightmares of humanity? Share your final thoughts in the comments below. A like and a subscribe are a promise that you have journeyed with Sleepless Mind, that you have heard the voice of Alaska land that is not just ice and snow, but a living story of history, spirituality, and power. Thank you for staying awake with us through these long nights, through the stories of a final frontier. Your patience and reflection are an invaluable inspiration. If these stories have touched you, please leave your mark by hitting like and subscribe so we can continue to explore the mysteries of the world in the long nights ahead. The night is late. So the next time you think of the cold, think not just of ice and snow, but of the silent wars, the empires that never sleep, and the secrets still lying dormant beneath the permafrost. Sleep well.
You've crossed the story. You felt every pulse in the dark, and I was there with you, quietly, always. That's why I left behind one last thing. Not to explain, not to impress, just to stay with you a little longer. A song I chose with care, as if tucking you in from across time and space. So go on, lay back. The music knows where to take you. you're still here, then you're something rare. Not many stay this long. So, thank you for choosing to stay. I'm here too, still awake, surrounded by the quiet glow of my editing screen, shaping the next stories just for you. If there's anything you want to leave behind, a whisper, a suggestion, even just a symbol, drop it in the comments. Because maybe, tomorrow night, you'll hear yourself echoed in a story that's never been told before. still here, even now? I have a feeling part of you is still wandering somewhere between wakefulness and dreaming. I know that feeling well because I'm still awake with you. In a quiet room, I'm gently laying out layers of sound, each breath, each beat, preparing the next journey we'll take together. If you're still listening, leave me a sign. Let me know how you're feeling or just where you are in this vast world. Because right now, in this stillness, you are not alone. You're still there, aren't you? I can't see you, but I can feel you. Like a soft signal pulsing across the silence. Over here, I'm still working, refining layers of sound, rewriting fragments of voice, building the landscape for our next adventure. One that you might inspire. If an idea comes to you, share it with me. Comment below. A theme, a memory, a strange dream. I read every word because I never tell these stories alone. I tell them with you.